Hello, fanatics. Welcome to True Crime Storytime. I am working on a mystery painting, and this True Crime Storytime is not a mystery. A quick backstory. Because I am so engrossed in true crime, I think Carl also has not so much of an interest, but when something comes up, he kind of talks to me about it. And he was talking to me, I can't even remember what he was talking about. And it reminded me of the Cray Twins. And I said, oh, you know who the Krays are? And he was like, no. And I'm like, how can you not know who they are? So that's who I'm going to be talking about today. The Cray Twins. Please tell me you know who they are. If you don't, you will at the end of this. I'm going to start off, obviously, as I always do, with their early life and a bit of a background. And we'll move through all of what they got up to. It is quite shocking how they became celebrities. They mixed with Frank Sinatra and Diana Dawes. And it's just like, whoa. You know? I mean, we have infamous serial killers. Ted Bundy is one, but not to this degree. Let's dive in. Please grab whatever you are working on. Come join me while we talk about the Krays. There are a lot of names that I will be bringing up here and there, so hopefully along the way I will try to simplify things and remind you who these people are along the way. But yeah. Side note, how can I word this? Bully, for those of you who know, he was my abuser. He married my mum, and Bully had a brother, and I remember I was a teenager. I can't remember how old I was, and his brother was in prison, and we went to visit him, and I'd never met him before, so I first met my air quote uncle when he was in prison. So that was an interesting experience. Yeah, so we were sat there, and obviously I don't know him or anything, what he was in for or anything like that. And he looked at me, the air quote uncle, and he said to me, oh, I'm in with Reggie, one of the twins. Do you want a signed photograph? And I just went, no, like, I regret it now, but I wasn't as into true crime as I am now, so I kind of regret that. But I think he was trying to be impressive, and it just wasn't impressing me. But anyway, nice little bit of information for you. My air quote uncle was in prison with Reggie, so yeah, he done his time, my air quote uncle, and then we got to know him outside of prison. But the whole family are messed up, obviously, with who my mum married. But get comfy, grab a project, make sure you have a cuppa, and let's talk about Reggie and Ronnie. Ronald and Reginald Cray were born on the 24th of October in 1933 in East London to Charles David Cray, a wardrobe dealer, and Violet Annie Lee. Their father was of Irish descent and their mother was Romani. The brothers were identical twins, with Reggie born 10 minutes before Ronnie. Their parents already had a 6-year-old son, Charles, and a sister, Violet, who died in infancy. When the twins were 3 years old, they contracted diphtheria. That explains everything. No, it doesn't. The Cray twins first attended Wood Close School in Brick Lane and then Daniel Street School. In 1938, the family moved from Steen Street in Haggerston to 178 Valence Road in Bethnal Green. During the Second World War, the twins were evacuated to East House in Hadley in Suffolk with their mother Violet and their older brother Charles. He's known as Charlie. I don't like Charles. I'm going to call him Charlie. They stayed at East House with the owners, Dr. and Mrs. Style, for about a year before moving back to London as Violet missed her friends and her family. While they were in Hadley, the twins attended Bridge Street Boys' School. When the twins were interviewed in 1989 while at Broadmoor Hospital, Ronnie described Hadley as their first time in the countryside. What appealed to the twins was, quote, quietness, the peacefulness of it, the fresh air, nice scenery, nice countryside, different from London. We used to go to a big hill called Constitution Hill and used to go sledging there in the winter time. The influence of their maternal grandfather, Jimmy, known as Cannonball Lee, caused the brothers to take up amateur boxing, then a popular pastime in the East End. Sibling rivalry spurred them on and both achieved some success. The Krays were called up to do national service in the British Army in March 1952. Although the pair reported to the depot of the Royal Fusiliers at the Tower of London, they attempted to leave after only a few minutes. When the corporal in charge tried to stop them, he was seriously injured by Ronnie, who punched him on the jaw. The Krays walked back to their East End home. They were arrested the next morning by the police and turned over to the army. In September, while AWOL, which is absent without leave, again, the twins assaulted a police constable who tried to arrest them. They became among the last prisoners to be held at the Tower of London before being transferred to Shepton Military Prison in Somerset for a month to await a court-martial. After they were convicted, both were sent to Buff's Home Counties Brigade Depot Jail in Canterbury in Kent. However, it became clear they were both to be dishonourably discharged from the army. The Kray's behaviour became worse. That's no joke. It really does. They dominated the exercise areas outside their one-man cells. They threw tantrums, emptied a latrine bucket over a sergeant, dumped a canteen full of hot tea on another guard, handcuffed a guard to their prison bars with a pair of stolen cuffs, and set their bedding on fire. Eventually they were moved to a communal cell where they assaulted their guard with a vase and escaped. After being quickly recaptured, they spent their last night in military custody in Canterbury, drinking cider, eating crisps and smoking, courtesy of the young national servicemen acting as their guards. The next day, the Krays were transferred to a civilian prison to serve sentences for the crimes they committed while AWOL. The Krays' criminal records and dishonourable discharges from the Royal Fusiliers ended their boxing careers, and the brothers turned nice, humble family men. The end. No, they didn't. The brothers turned to crime full time. They bought a run-down snooker club in Mile End where they started several protection rackets. By the end of the 1950s, the Krays were working for J. Murray from Liverpool and were involved in hijacking, armed robbery and arson, through which they acquired other clubs and properties. In 1960, Ronnie was imprisoned for 18 months for running a protection racket and related threats. While he was in prison, Peter Rackman, head of a landlord operation, sold Reggie a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn to ward off threats of further extortion. The Berkeley Hotel now stands at that very location. Ownership of Esmeralda's Barn increased the Krays' influence in the West End by making them celebrities as well as criminals. The twins adopted a norm according to which anyone who failed to show due respect would be severely punished. Both Ronnie and Reggie notoriously laundered money through dog and horse tracks, as well as through their businesses, which led to several others being investigated during the mid-1960s for their cooperation with the crimes that are about to be talked about. They were assisted by a banker named Alan Cooper, who wanted protection against the Krays' rivals, the Richardson Gang, based in South London. In the 1960s, the Cray Twins were widely seen as prosperous and charming celebrity nightclub owners and were part of the swinging London scene. A part of their fame was due to their non-criminal activities as popular figures on the celebrity circuit, being photographed by David Bailey on more than one occasion and socialising with lords, MPs, socialites and show business characters, including George Raft, Frank Sinatra, Peter Sellers, Judy Garland, Diana Dawes, Sammy Davis Jr., Shirley Bassey, Liza Minnelli, Cliff Richard, Dusty Springfield, Jane Mansfield, Danny LaRue, and Barbara Windsor. Quote, "They were the best years of our lives. They called them the swinging 60s. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were rulers of the pop music. Carnaby Street ruled the fashion world, and me and my brother ruled London. We were effing untouchable, said Ronnie Cray in his autobiography, My Story. In July 1964, an expose in the tabloid newspaper, the Sunday Mirror, insinuated that Ronnie had begun a homosexual relationship with Lord Boothby, a Conservative politician. Bearing in mind, this is at a time when homosexuality was a criminal offence in the UK, which is ridiculous, but it was. Although no names were printed in the piece, the twins threatened the journalists involved, and Boothby threatened to sue the newspaper with the help of Labour Party leader Harold Wilson's solicitor Arnold Goodman. In the face of this, the Sunday Mirror backed down, sacking its editor, printing an apology and paying Boothby £40,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Because of this, other newspapers were unwilling to expose the Cray's connections and criminal activities. And you kind of get it. You kind of understand how they got away with so much, because they ran their empire through fear. End of. And when you're threatening people, and I mean, I can't even imagine. They must have been terrifying. Decades later, Channel 4 established the truth of the allegations and released a documentary on the subject called The Gangster and the Pervert Peer. I mean, really. 2009. Police investigated the Crays on several occasions, but the brothers' reputation for violence made witnesses afraid to testify. There was also a problem for both main political parties. The Conservative Party was unwilling to press the police to end the Cray's power for fear that the Boothby connection would again be publicised. And the Labour Party, in power from October 1964, but with an extremely thin majority in the House of Commons, and the prospect of another general election needing to be called in the very near future, did not want connections between Ronnie and Tom Drieberg, a relatively open gay Labour MP, to get into the public realm. Ronnie shot and killed George Cornell, a member of the Richardson gang, at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel on the 9th of March 1966. And if you remember, you had the Crays on one side of London, and the Richardson gang was their rival on the other side of London. The day before, there had been a shootout at Mr. Smith's, that's a nightclub in Catford, involving the Richardsons and Richard Hart, an associate of the Crays, who was shot dead. This public shootout led to the arrest of nearly all of the Richardson gang. However, Cornell, by chance, was not present at the club during the shooting and was not arrested. After visiting the hospital to check up on his friends, he randomly chose to visit the Blind Beggar pub, only a mile away from where the Crays lived. Ronnie was drinking beer in another pub when he learned about Cornell's whereabouts. He went to the Blind Beggar with his driver, Scotch Jack, real name John Dixon, and his assistant Ian Barry. Ronnie went into the pub with Ian Barry, walked straight up to Cornell and shot him in the head in public view. Barry, confused by what happened, fired 5 shots in the air, warning onlookers not to report what happened to the police. Just before he was shot, Cornell remarked, quote, "Well, look who's here," end quote. He died at 3:30 a.m. in hospital. Ronnie was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time of this killing. According to some sources, Ronnie killed Cornell because he referred to him as a, quote, "fat puff," end quote, a derogatory term used for gay men, just in case you didn't know. During a confrontation between the Krays and the Richardsons at the Astor Club on Christmas Day in 1965, Richardson member Frankie Fraser was tried for the murder of Richard Hart at Mr. Smith's nightclub, but was found not guilty. Richardson member Ray, the Belgian, testified that he saw Cornell kicking Richard Hart. Witnesses would not cooperate with the police in the murder case due to the intimidation, and the trial ended inconclusively without pointing to any suspect in particular. And that's sometimes how they do it, isn't it? They paint a picture that, oh, it could have been Joe Bloggs, because Joe Bloggs was near that pub at that time, and he may not have done the murder, but it's enough to sway the jury to think that Joe Bloggs might have possibly done it, which means that the person on trial didn't do it, therefore reasonable doubt. And that's how they do it. But he managed to get off this murder charge without actually pointing to someone who could have been there and could have done it. On the 12th of December 1966, the Krays helped Frank Mitchell, known as the Mad Axeman, I don't even want to know how he got that nickname, to escape from Dartmoor prison. Ronnie had befriended Mitchell while serving time together in Wandsworth prison. Mitchell felt that the authorities should review his case for parole, so Ronnie thought he would be doing him a favour by getting him out of Dartmoor, highlighting his case in the media and forcing the authorities to act. Weird way of thinking. I kind of see what he's saying, but weird. Because now surely he's a convict on the loose, therefore he gets more time. But okay. Once Mitchell had escaped, the Krays held him at a friend's flat in Barking Road, East Ham. He was a large man with a mental disorder, and he was quite difficult to control. Subsequently, he just disappeared without a trace, but the Krays were acquitted of his murder. Freddie Foreman, who was a friend of the Krays, claimed in his autobiography, Respect, that he shot Mitchell dead as a favour to the twins and disposed of his body at sea. In October 1967, 4 months. Oh, okay, I should quickly say that Reggie got married to Frances and she committed suicide some months later. I will talk about her later on, but Reggie was encouraged by his brother to kill Jack, known as the Hat, McVitie. He was a minor member of the Cray gang who had failed to fulfil a £1,000 contract, £500 of which he had been paid in advance, to kill their financial advisor, Leslie Payne. And because Reggie was grieving, he's kind of gone along with this, but you'll see why this becomes the undoing, okay? McVitie was lured to a basement in Evering Road, Stoke Newton, on the pretence of a party. Upon entering the premises, he saw Ronnie seated in the front room. Ronnie approached, letting loose a barrage of verbal abuse and cutting McVitie below his eye with a piece of broken glass. It's believed that an argument then broke out between the twins and McVitie. As the argument got more heated, Reggie pointed a handgun at McVitie's head and pulled the trigger twice, but the gun failed to discharge. McVitie was then held in a bear hug by the twins' cousin, Ronnie Hart, and Reggie was handed a carving knife. Then he stabbed McVitie in the face and the stomach, driving the blade into his neck while twisting on the knife, not stopping even as he lay dying on the floor. Reggie had committed a very public murder against someone who many members of the firm did not deserve to die. The firm is their gang name. In an interview in 2000, shortly after Reggie's death, Freddie Foreman revealed that McVitie had a reputation for leaving carnage behind him due to his habitual consumption of drugs and heavy drinking, and his having threatened to harm the twins and their family. So McVitie is drunk or high or probably both, and he's issuing these threats. Who knows if he meant them, but either way, so that's why the Krays turned on him. But as you'll see later, other members of the firm, as they called themselves, then question, what if I upset him and that could happen to me? Tony and Chris, I don't even know how to pronounce their surnames. Lamborino. I'm just going to call them Tony and Chris. They're brothers, and Ronnie Bender helped clear up the evidence of this crime and attempted to assist in the disposal of the body. With McVitie's corpse being too big to fit into the boot of a car, it was wrapped in an eiderdown and put on the back seat. Brother Tony drove the car with brother Chris and Ronnie Bender following behind. So Tony drove his car with McVitie's body in it. Chris and Bender followed behind. Crossing the Blackwall Tunnel, Chris lost Tony's car and spent up to 15 minutes looking around the area. They found Tony outside St Mary's Church, where he had run out of petrol. McVitie's body was still inside the car. The body was left in the car and the 3 gangsters returned home. Bender then went on to phone Charlie Cray, the older brother of the twins, informing them that it had, quote, been dealt with. When the Crays heard where they had left McVitie's corpse, the twins were livid and desperately phoned Foreman, who was then running a pub in Southwark, to see if he could dispose of the body. With dawn breaking, Foreman found the car. He broke into the car, took the body out of the car, drove the body to New Haven, where, with the help of a trawlerman, the body was bound with chicken wire and dumped in the English Channel. This event started turning many people against the Crays, and some were prepared to testify to Scotland Yard as to what had happened, fearing that what happened to McVitie could easily happen to them. Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard, known as Nipper, Reed of Scotland Yard, was promoted to the murder squad, and his first assignment was to bring down the Cray Twins. I'm going to refer to him as Nipper moving forward. Nipper is Detective Chief Superintendent of Scotland Yard. During the first half of 1964, Nipper, the policeman, had been investigating their activities, but publicity and official denials of Ron's relationship with Boothby made the evidence that he collected useless. Nipper went after the twins again in 1967, but frequently came up against the East End, quote, wall of silence, which discouraged anyone from providing information to the police. By the end of 1967, Nipper, the policeman, had built up enough evidence against the Crays. Witness statements incriminated them, as did other evidence, but none made a convincing case on any one charge. Early in 1968, the Crays employed Alan Bruce Cooper, who sent Paul Elvery to Glasgow to buy explosives for a car bomb. Elvery was a radio engineer who put Radio Such on the air in 1964, which is later renamed Radio City. After police detained him in Scotland, he confessed to being involved in 3 murder attempts. The evidence was weakened by Cooper, who claimed that he was an agent for the US Treasury Department investigating links between the American Mafia and the Cray gang. The botched murders by Elvey were his attempt at putting the blame on the Crays. Cooper was being employed as a source by one of Nipper's superior officers, and Nipper tried using him as a trap for the Crays, but the Crays just avoided him. They knew something was off. Eventually, Scotland Yard decided to arrest the Crays on evidence already collected, in the hopes that other witnesses would come forward once the Crays were in custody. On the 8th of May 1968, The Crays and 15 other members of the firm were arrested. Exceptional measures were used to stop collusion between the accused. Nipper, the superintendent, then secretly interviewed each of the arrested and offered each member of the firm a deal if they testified against the others. Whilst in prison, the Crays had come up with a plan, which included having Scotch Jack to confess to the murder of Cornell, Ronnie Hart to take the McVitie murder, and Albert Donahue to stand for Mitchell. Donahue told the twins directly that he was not prepared to be persuaded into pleading guilty to the anger of the twins. He then informed Nipper, the superintendent, via his mother that he was ready to cooperate. Nipper set up another secret interview, and Donahue was the first to tell the police everything that he knew. Ronnie Hart had initially not been arrested and was not even a name initially sought after by the police, but with Donahue's testimony, Ronnie Hart was arrested, offered the same terms as the others, and then Ronnie Hart told Nipper, the police, everything that had happened during the McVitie murder, although he did not know anything about what happened to the body. This was the first time that the police knew exactly who was involved and offered them a solid case to prosecute the twins for McVitie's murder. Although Nipper knew for certain that Ronnie Cray had murdered George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub, no one had been prepared to testify against the twins out of fear. Upon finding out the twins intended to coerce him, Scotch Jack Dixon also turned in everything he knew about Cornell's murder. Although not a witness to the murder, he was an accessory, having driven Ronnie Cray and Ian Barry to that pub. The police still needed a witness to the murder. They managed to track down the barmaid who was working in the pub at the time of the murder, gave her a secret identity, and she testified to seeing Ronnie kill Cornell. Frank Mitchell's escape and disappearance were much harder to obtain evidence for, since the majority of those arrested were not involved with his planned escape and disappearance. Nipper, the police officer, decided to proceed with the case and have a separate trial for Mitchell once the twins had been convicted. The twins' defence, under their counsel, John Platts Mills, QC, consisted of flat denials of all charges and discrediting witnesses by pointing out their criminal past. Justice Melford Stevenson said, quote, "In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities," end quote. It was the longest murder hearing in the history of British criminal justice, during which Justice Melford Stevenson stated on the sentences, quote, "I recommend they," meaning both, "I recommend they should not be less than 30 years," end quote. In March 1969, both were sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 30 years for the murders of Cornell and McVitie. Their brother Charlie was imprisoned for 10 years for his part in the murders. Ronnie and Reggie Cray were allowed under a large police guard to attend the funeral service of their mother Violet on the 11th of August 1982, following her death from cancer a week earlier. They were not allowed to attend her burial in the Cray family plot at Chingford Mount Cemetery. The funeral was attended by celebrities including Diana Dawes and underworld figures known to the Crays. To avoid the publicity that had surrounded their mother's funeral, the twins did not ask for permission to attend their father's funeral in March 1983. Ronnie Cray was a Category A prisoner, denied almost all liberties and not allowed to mix with other prisoners. He was eventually certified insane, his paranoid schizophrenia being tempered with constant medication. In 1979, he was committed and lived the remainder of his life in Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire. Reggie Cray, constantly being refused parole, was locked up in Maidstone prison for 8 years. He was a Category B prisoner. Now, when I looked up the difference between Category A, which is reserved for inmates who have been determined a threat to the public, the police, or national security. I would say both of them were, but Reggie was a Category B prisoner. Now, I also looked up what's the difference between Category A and Category B. And B, I kid you not, said from Google itself, okay? It said, unless you are a Category A prisoner, when you are first committed to prison, you will automatically be categorised as a Category B prisoner, who are defined as, quote, those who do not require maximum security, but for whom escape needs to be made very difficult, like, end quote. Now, I would assume whether you are A, B or C, I don't know if it goes any lower than that, but I should imagine they are all made to be very difficult, like, to escape prison. But there we go. In 1997, Reggie was transferred to the Category C Wayland prison in Norfolk, which, you know, is probably very easy to escape from. In 1985, officials at Broadmoor Hospital discovered a business card of Ronnie's that led to evidence that the twins, from separate institutions, were operating Cray Enterprises, a lucrative bodyguard and protection services for Hollywood stars, together with their older brother Charlie Cray and an accomplice at large. Among their clients was Frank Sinatra, who hired 18 bodyguards from Cray Enterprises on his visit to the 1985 Wimbledon Championships. Documents released under Freedom of Information laws revealed that although officials were concerned about this operation, they believed that there was no legal basis to shut it down. In Ronnie's book, My Story, and a comment to writer Robin McGibbon on the Cray tapes, Ronnie stated, quote, I'm bisexual, not homosexual, bisexual. In the 1960s, he also planned to marry a woman named Monica, whom he had dated for nearly 3 years. He called her, quote, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, end quote. This is mentioned in Reggie's book, Born Fighter. Also, extracts are mentioned in Ron's own book, My Story, and in Cray's books, Sorted, Murder, Madness and Marriage, and Free at Last. Ronnie was arrested before he had the chance to marry Monica, and although she married his ex-boyfriend, 59 letters were sent to her between May and December 1968, when he was imprisoned, show Ronnie still had feelings for her, and his love for her was very clear. He referred to her as, quote, my little angel and my little doll, end quote. She also still had feelings for Ronnie. These letters were auctioned in 2010. A letter Ronnie sent to his mother Violet from prison in 1968 also refers to Monica. Quote, if they let me see Monica and put me with Reg, I could not ask for more, end quote. He went on to say, Monica is the only girl I have liked in my life. She is a lovely little person, as you know. When you see her, tell her I'm in love with her more than ever, end quote. Ronnie subsequently married twice, marrying Elaine Mildner in 1985 at Broadmoor Chapel before the couple divorced in 1989, following which he married Kate Howard, whom he divorced in 1994. Kate Howard lived for a number of years in Headcorn, Kent, in Forge Lane. In an interview with author John Pearson, Ronnie indicated he identified with the 19th century soldier Charles George Gordon. Quote, Gordon was like me, homosexual, and he met his death like a man. When it's time for me to go, I hope I can do the same, end quote. In his biography of the twins, The Profession of Violence, Pearson claimed that Ronnie Cray admitted that he and Reggie discovered they were both gay in their adolescence and would often have sex together, activity which continued into their later life. They don't mean Reggie and Ronnie, though that would explain a lot. Okay. I'm quite shocked about this part of the story time because Reggie and Ronnie. So I delved into a rabbit hole, and there is John Pearson, who has interviewed the Crays, wrote several books on them, and he claims that they did indeed have an incestuous relationship, because they were worried that rivals would see their sexuality, Ronnie being a homosexual and Reggie being bisexual, as a sign of weakness, so they only had sex with each other in order to keep that secret, because you can't trust anyone in the world of crime. We know this generally, but especially in that time. And what's really shocking is, like I said earlier, in this time frame, being gay was a criminal offence, which I reiterate is stupid, but it was. So they kept their secret by being incestuous, which is really quite even more shocking than actually being gay or bisexual. But there you go. turns out that according to John Pearson, it is true. Reggie married Frances Shee in 1965. She died by suicide 2 years later. Reggie married Roberta Jones, whom he met while still in prison. She was helping to publicise a film she was making about Ronnie, who had died in hospital 2 years earlier. There are a whole lot of controversies surrounding the Krays, their enterprises, what truly happened with their crimes, what really happened with Frances. And I want to just take a minute for Frances alone, because it makes me really sad. I don't know the ins and outs of their marriage. I can tell that the Krays are... I remember seeing the film years and years ago, the old one, what I call old one, and it's just tragic. Whatever happened in Reggie and Frances's marriage, Frances committed suicide, and that's tragic and very, very sad. And I just want to take a minute for her, because no matter what we think, whether we feel that Reggie bullied her or whether Frances knew he was gay, and a bit like Charles and Diana, the royal Charles and Diana, she was in love with him, he was not in love with her, and that's abundantly clear, but that's going off topic. But let's pretend that Reggie is gay, or Reggie is sleeping with brother, or whatever. It doesn't matter at this moment in time. What matters is that she felt the only way out of any situation that she felt she was in was suicide, and that is just absolutely heartbreaking and tragic. Okay, so going back to the controversies. There was a long-running campaign with some minor celebrity support to have the twins released from prison. The successive Home Secretaries vetoed the idea, largely on the grounds that both Kray's prison records were marred by violence towards other inmates. So they could have been sweet-talked round, they could have manoeuvred some kind of an early release, but the fact that they were still very violent in prison, they said no. The campaign gathered momentum after the release of a film based on their lives called The Krays, 1990. There you go, that's probably the one I'm thinking about. Yes, it is. Produced by Ray Burdis. It starred Spandau Ballet brothers Martin and Gary Kemp, who played the roles of Reggie and Ronnie respectively. Ronnie, Reggie and Charlie received £255,000 for the film. Just do the math on that. That's times 3. Reggie wrote, quote, "I seem to have walked a double path most of my life. Perhaps an extra step in one of those directions might have seen me celebrated rather than notorious." End quote. And I just want to go back to something he said earlier, or one of them said earlier, about when they were hanging out with all the celebs and that was the best time of their life. They could have just been celebrity club owners and lived that lifestyle and probably had all the money that goes with it without all the criminal interactions that they had. Others point to Reggie's violent prison record when he was being detained separately from Ronnie, and argue that in reality the twins' temperaments were a little different. Reggie's marriage to Frances in 1965 lasted 8 months when she left, although the marriage was never formally dissolved. An inquest came to the conclusion that she had committed suicide, but in 2002, an ex-lover of Reggie came forward to allege that Frances was murdered by a jealous Ronnie. Bradley Allardyce spent 3 years in Maidstone prison with Reggie and explained, quote, "I was sitting in my cell with Reg, and it was one of those nights where we turned the lights down low and put some nice music on." It sounds like a hotel room. Put some nice music on, and sometimes he would reminisce. He would get really deep and open up to me. He suddenly broke down and said, "I'm going to tell you something I've only told 2 people, and something I've carried around with me, something that has been a black hole since the day he found out." He put his head on my shoulder and told me Ronnie killed Frances. He told Reggie what he had done 2 days after. End quote. A television documentary, The Gangster and the Pervert Peer, in 2009, claimed that Ronnie Cray was a rapist of men. Again, this is controversy, it's not fact, it's just claims that have come forward or speculation. The programme also detailed his relationship with Conservative peer Bob Boothby, as well as a Daily Mirror investigation into Lord Boothby's dealings with the Cray brothers. Ronnie died on the 17th of March 1995 at the age of 61 at Wrexham Park Hospital in Slough, Berkshire. He had suffered a heart attack at Broadmoor Hospital 2 days earlier. Reggie was allowed out of prison in handcuffs to attend the funeral. Reggie died a free man in his sleep on the 1st of October 2000 at the age of 66. During his incarceration, Reggie Cray became a born-again Christian. He was freed from Wayland on the 26th of August 2000 on compassionate grounds, on the direction of Home Secretary Jack Straw, following the diagnosis of cancer. He had been diagnosed with bladder cancer earlier that year, and the illness had been declared as terminal. The final weeks of his life were spent with his wife of 3 years, Roberta, in a suite at the Townhouse Hotel at Norwich. After he left the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital on the 22nd of September 2000. 10 days after his death, he was buried beside his brother Ronnie in Chingford Mount Cemetery. During the funeral, crowds of thousands lined up to applaud. Charlie Cray, Ronnie and Reggie's older brother, was released from prison in 1975 after serving 7 of his 10-year sentence for his role in their gangland crimes. Charlie was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment in 1997 for conspiracy to smuggle cocaine in an undercover drug sting. He died in prison of natural causes on the 4th of April 2000, aged 72, with Reggie allowed out of prison to attend his older brother's funeral. And there we have it. The Cray Twins. Several things are going through my mind. These boys who were brought up with a loving mum, a volatile dad. I think the dad used to beat the mum, and then as they got more experienced, shall we say. They dominated Dad, and said, if you ever hit Mum again, be warned. And he never did. And he just like quietly got on with life in the family. But the twins dictated a lot in the house. Always looked after Mum, very close to Mum. And then they just ruled London, in post-war London. They forged their own path. They forged their own rules. They didn't want to go in the army, so they found a way to get out of that. And just forged their way through life. Yeah. Another thing is that they did all of that and they went to prison, I think at the age of 32. They were in the 30s, and then they spent the rest of their lives in prison, whereas people generally go about their lives and forget about criminals that are now in prison. That never happened with them. They were still running enterprises. They were still getting paid for films. Very different era in a lot of ways. Like the being gay in the 60s was against the law. It's ridiculous. I keep saying that because I'm not racist, sexist, ageist. I'm not anything. I find it ridiculous. But there you go. So that is the Cray Twins. I don't know what it is, but I knew of the Krays before, but when I sit down to do a true crime episode, I get really pulled in. And obviously there's things I uncovered today that I did not know, such as the closeness of the brothers. I had no idea that went on. It does explain a lot though. It does, because they were very entwined, and I thought maybe it's because they were twins that they were so close, but it turns out it wasn't just that. But anyone who crossed one crossed both, which would be that the same thing had they just been brothers close in age, not necessarily twins. You know, you cross one, you cross the other. It kind of goes hand in hand. But I do think Ronnie was the more volatile. Whether he had inward anger for not being able to be out and proud, so to speak, I don't know. But he seems to be the more volatile one, and Reggie sort of reined him in a little bit. But obviously they went down for the murder of George Cornell and Jack the Hat McVie. That was their undoing, and turning on their own firm member solidified their fate. A lot of people are shocked that their gang members, who they were close to, then turned on them. But is it really that shocking? I mean, obviously, I know we're talking 1960s, and they kind of forged the way in a lot of ways. But they were, one, saving their own bacon, two, making sure that they couldn't get out to then go after them, I guess. So it kind of makes sense why people would turn, in my logic anyway, doing true crimes. So, as always, thank you for spending time with me. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I have. I have enjoyed learning more about Reggie and Ronnie, and they're still very iconic, even 54 years in 2022 that they were arrested. 54 years ago, and here we are still talking about them today. So, and I'm not the only one. But yeah, there you go. I do hope you've enjoyed spending time with me and learning all about the Krays. Did you already know about the Krays? Did you know as much as I have talked about today? Anything shocking? Let me know in the comments. As always, please do leave your thoughts and comments down below. I love interacting with you, especially on my true crime, because I've invested pretty much a week in in each case that I upload. So yeah, I hope you've got some of your projects done, and I shall see you next week. I have another high profile case for you next week. Yeah, I'm going to enjoy delving into that one again, because again, it is a case that we all know. Trust me, we all know this case, but it's going to be interesting to see what comes out that I don't know about, or just, yeah, you'll have to wait till next week to see who we are going to be talking about. As always, guys, stay safe out there. Bye.